everybody. We have a wonderful topic today that everybody will have an opinion about: food. And more specifically, we're going to talk about New Orleans and South Louisiana food, the cuisines that really put Louisiana on the culinary map, not just in America, but also worldwide. And we're going to talk about some chefs who have made important contributions to our foodways here. And we're going to talk about the cuisines that are the most popular, the most well-known within New Orleans Metro Center, and then also out through into the Cajun country. And we're going to talk about two women whose influence came at exactly the right time, in exactly the right amounts to make Louisiana's cuisine just sparkle. I want to thank Amanda Taylor, the director of the Concordia Parish Public Library, and her wonderful team who make these things happen, and to Delta Bank for sponsoring this program as well, so we can all come together and today talk about great chefs and restaurants of New Orleans. The official motto of New Orleans is "Laissez les bon temps rouler." It's let the good times roll. And there's probably not any better phrase to describe what New Orleans is. It is one of the world's greatest cities. It's suffering and has suffered because of some double whammies, Katrina and COVID. It is struggling, as so many of our American cities are now, trying to come out of the pandemic and find a kind of normalcy. There's chaos, but it doesn't matter. It's still a wonderful destination for people to go to. And one of the reasons they go there is the food. We had some friends from England visiting us a few years back, and the one thing they wanted to see in Louisiana was New Orleans. We managed to broaden their horizons a little bit, and they discovered there were other things besides just New Orleans, but they fell in love with New Orleans, as most everyone does. If you look at this map of New Orleans, you realize that the city is actually almost completely surrounded by water. It sits along the Mississippi River. It's bordered by Lake Pontchartrain to the north and the Gulf of Mexico to the east. The city is also divided into what we call 19 districts or neighborhoods, and those terms are kind of interchangeable depending on which government agency is talking about which area. Every one of those, though, is distinctly different from all the others. They have very rich cultures that are wonderful to experience. Of them, there are three that I want to focus on with our discussion today. They happen to be the best known. One is the French Quarter, which you're going to learn is known for a lot more things than just Bourbon Street. The Garden District, which is a very beautiful area of town, park-like. And Treme, which is the oldest continuously populated African-American neighborhood in the United States. This is a picture of the French Quarter. You get the sense here of the colors, almost Caribbean, the tropical Caribbean influence. It's a very beautiful, special, old part of the city. I like this picture because you can see one of the towers of the modern city just beyond, and so you get a nice feeling of the two distinct cities that are within the town. The French Quarter is one of the oldest communities in the United States, and it seems to attract artists, writers, performers, restaurateurs, and businessmen. The Garden District is very park-like. It has beautiful old homes, as you can see this one here. It's one of the most beautiful neighborhoods in our country. It was originally a group of plantations, and the owners sold them off to wealthy Americans who were moving in and who wanted to live outside of the French Quarter. They didn't want to be French, they wanted to be American. It's known for its architecture. These houses are gorgeous. They're 19th century mansions, a lot of gingerbreading. They're decorated, many of them in the late Victorian styles. And so a walk through the Garden District is an architectural treat. And then the third neighborhood is represented by this picture. It's Treme. It's less affluent, but it's beautiful in its own way. And the people who live there have great sense of pride, just as great as anyone who lives in the Garden District or who lives in the French Quarter. Treme was founded in 1783, and as I told you, it's the oldest African-American neighborhood continuously inhabited in the United States. Like the Garden District, it too was once a plantation. Claude Treme owned it, and he was a very astute businessman. He began subdividing the land, and in 1810, he sold it to the city of New Orleans. The architecture features really fine examples of the Creole cottage and of double shotgun houses. It also boasts Louis Armstrong Park. New Orleans also has a business district. And the reason I want to point this one out is because New Orleans is not just a food town and a joyful play town. It's a deadly serious business town. The warehouse district and the arts district are both sort of encapsulated into what they call the central business district. It's located just beyond the French Quarter. In that earlier picture, you saw the tower. Much of the New Orleans business is centered in this area. And you've also got the Superdome here. So every time the Saints are playing, it's at home. It's a pretty busy spot. What do people say about New Orleans? The late Anthony Bourdain, he lived he was born in 56 and died in 2018. He said this, quote, "There is no place on earth even remotely like New Orleans. Don't even try to compare it to anywhere else." This is a man who traveled the world and sampled everything. Playwright Tennessee Williams also had an opinion. And before I tell it to you, I apologize to the people who may be upset by this statement. He said, "America has only 3 cities, New York, San Francisco, and New Orleans. Everywhere else is Cleveland." Sorry, Cleveland. Lenny Kravitz, entertainer, modern day entertainer, said this: "There's certain things in life that I love. One is architecture and music, culture, food, people. New Orleans has all of that, and so it does." Of those, though, there's one more that happens to be my personal favorite, and it was spoken by Mark Twain, great American novelist. He said, quote, "New Orleans food is as delicious as the less criminal forms of sin." In New Orleans, and really recognized throughout Louisiana, there are 2 primary food types that we're the state is most identified with. One is Creole food, and the other is Cajun food. Now we do have, because of the international quality of New Orleans being a port city and so forth, we do have an influx and therefore some influence from the Thai and from the Vietnamese, but primarily Creole and Cajun are the 2. Creole is defined as a fusion of actually a multiple number of cultures: French, Spanish, Italian, German, Caribbean, West African, Portuguese, and Native American. All of those have come together to create what we call Creole food. It's also called city food. It's just a tad more sophisticated in presentation and in form than the Cajun food. It also has this distinguishing feature. It uses tomatoes, and the Cajun food generally does not. So if you order a shrimp Creole, for example, you're going to find it in a tomato sauce. You order shrimp in Cajun country, you're going to find it in maybe a butter garlic sauce that's very thin, or you may find it in a roux-laden heavy gravy like an etouffee. Cajun food, I like to call not just Cajun, but country food, because it really speaks to our rural roots in the country. It too is a fusion, but it's a fusion of what was readily available to the people living in the Cajun country of South Louisiana. It depended on foods that could be caught or killed or grown near one's home. Traditional Cajun dishes would be jambalaya, gumbos made with okra, say, and sausage and shrimp and filet, boudin and the other sausages, boudin balls, rice and gravy. Does not use tomatoes. Tomatoes are not in it. And it's considered, where Creole food is the city food, Cajun food is considered country food. First, you make a roux, but to make Creole or Cajun, you make roux in different ways. This is a picture of a classic roux for Creole cooking. Creole food was created by descendants of the French and Spanish upper class that ruled primarily during the 18th century in the New Orleans area. Over time, that group expanded, and it included native-born slaves of African descent and free people of color, and all of that mixed together, the French, the Spanish, and the African American, and then the free people of color who'd been influenced in some ways by French. That all added to the gumbo of the food that would be known as Creole food. This ubiquitous roux that appears as a base for both Creole food and Cajun food, the distinguishing feature is that, as the picture showed you earlier, Creole dishes roux are made with flour and butter, while Cajun roux is made with flour and oil. This is a picture of shrimp Creole beside a bit of rice. Most of the dishes in Louisiana have a base of rice, more so in the Cajun cooking than in the Creole, but here with the shrimp Creole in that heavy tomato sauce, clearly is a rice dish. Creole food is a little bit more sophisticated, and it's considered to be sort of an aristocratic food. Cajun food's country cooking. Dishes, Creole dishes often have, they start with very creamy soups, very rich sauces. I don't know how those people stayed as thin as they appear in their pictures, but they had very rich diets. Because New Orleans was an international port city, it also meant that the people there had access to exotic spices that folks just out in the rural areas normally wouldn't have. Now, the rich planters out in the rural area would ship those spices up the Mississippi route to their plantations so that their dishes could be cooked the way they were cooked in New Orleans. But it was at great expense. That was not something that was really readily available to the Cajuns. This is a picture of Louisiana, the state, and in green is that portion of the state that we call Acadiana. And this is the portion of the state where we have the Cajun food. Cajun food was created by French settlers. They were colonists. They had first settled in Canada in the Acadia region and then got exiled out of there, and they came to Louisiana and they formed their own Acadiana. There are 4 regions that make up this, and the reason I'm going to tell you about them is because each one provided a distinctly different set of food ingredients that conspired together to create Cajun country cooking. The Lafourche and Teche areas, these are where the levees and the bayous were, that's one region. The Attakapas Indian land, the Cajun prairies, we call them. The Atchafalaya Basin, which is the heavy swamplands, think alligator sausage, and New Orleans area and Houma, which had the coastal marches. This is not the city of New Orleans. This is the outlying region beyond it. This is a picture of boudin. Boudin is the most popular sausage that's made in Louisiana, and it's a Cajun specialty. It's made with pork, sausage, generally rice, and of course lots of seasonings. These early settlers in exile, they were in poverty. They had to improvise, and they had to live off the land. They were wonderful, wonderful people, talented at finding mushrooms and herbs and different things that would enhance their dishes. The Cajuns combined foods available from all 4 of the Acadiana regions to develop this cuisine that we call Cajun country. Because there was no refrigeration, then the Cajuns learned to use every single spot of every animal that they slaughtered. There's a funny saying in South Louisiana that the only thing left of the pig was the squeak. Andouille, another beautiful sausage, and tasso, a wonderful spiced ham. Both of these are essential to Cajun country cooking. Most essential, though, are the 3 ingredients you see here. This is called the Cajuns' Holy Trinity. It's absolutely essential to any Cajun dish. It's onion, celery, and bell pepper. You make the roux and you add these 3 and then seasonings, and you've got your base for virtually every Cajun dish. Seasoning's very important to the Cajuns. They relied heavily on paprika, thyme, filet, and cayenne. And of course, they could grow the peppers, so they had access to things like the cayenne. Justin Wilson was the first television chef in Louisiana. Some of you may remember his shows. They would be on PBS or LPB on Saturday mornings, and they were cooking shows. And as you see the picture here, he's in the outfit that was his uniform. He died in 2001, and we lost a real treasure there. Jim and I had the pleasure of knowing Justin Wilson and becoming good friends with him. He was quite an interesting character, far more interesting than the character he played on his television show. During the past 100 years, these 2 types of cuisines, the Creole and the Cajun country, have become more and more popular, especially after chefs and smart businesswomen began spreading the word about how wonderful they were. When Creole and Cajun country recipes were blended, then something happened in America. The modern American food movement was born. You know, if you ask anybody just about, when they think of New Orleans, what food do they think of? 9 times out of 10, they're going to mention the po' boy. And rightly so. Po' boys are wonderful, and they're very much ubiquitous to the New Orleans scene. The urban legend about the po' boy is that when businessmen would finish with their day's work, they would drop off at the bar and have a drink, and then maybe they'd have another drink, and sometimes they would have perhaps still another little drink, and before they knew it, they'd lost track of time. And so they would run by and pick up a fried oyster po' boy wrapped in brown paper, and they would take it home to the little wife to sort of smooth things over. That's the urban legend, but that's not the truth about where po' boys began. It's true that po' boys were first made in New Orleans, but they weren't made by slightly inebriated businessmen. They originated in 1929 during the streetcar strike. And the streetcar is such an important, or at that time, was such an important method of transportation within the city of New Orleans that a strike by the streetcar conductors was a big deal. And it lasted for a while. The po' boy was first served at Martin Brothers French Market and Coffee Stand. Benny and Clovis Martin had both been streetcar conductors in the 1910s, And then in 1922, they decided to open this little restaurant. In 1929, when the strike was ongoing, they saw the strikers, those poor boys, and they decided to give sandwiches away to them because they were not earning any money, obviously, while they were on strike. The first Martin po' boys were fried potatoes, gravy, little bits of roast beef, and all on French bread. There's a wonderful little restaurant which was described to us when we first were told about it as a little hole in the wall called Uglesich's. They helped also using po' boys as a way to help those who didn't have enough. They had a little shop, and it was kind of a hole in the wall, but very, very clean and neat, on Baron. It was in the Garden District. And it was opened in 1924 by Croatian immigrants. During the Great Depression, times were so hard in New Orleans, and these Croatian immigrants understood what deprivation and poverty was. And so they began giving away po' boys to people who couldn't afford to pay to eat. And their po' boys were fried egg po' boys. So good protein, filled their tummies and filled them with something that would actually help sustain them. You know, the story of New Orleans cuisine is actually a combination of stories of remarkable cooks, chefs, and restaurateurs who lived there and devoted their lives to the craft. Without those cooks and chefs and restaurateurs who made New Orleans and Louisiana food known worldwide, much would have been lost. Louisiana's food culture is a treasure. Two women helped the world discover New Orleans cuisine. They didn't know each other in the beginning, but they became good friends. It's books about these two women that I'm going to recommend to you today that you take a good look at and check out and read, because I think you'll enjoy them very much. The first one is Miss Ella of Commander's Palace. It's by Ella Brennan and her daughter, T. Adelaide Martin. It was published in September of 2016, and it's considered an autobiography and memoir. Ella is telling the story, but T. Martin, her daughter, is helping to fill in some of the blanks. Ella grew up in the Irish Channel of New Orleans, and you can see from this map, you can see it's in the yellow, and then you have just to the north of it, the Garden District, and then there's Truro and Uptown. It's a working class neighborhood. It's not the Garden District. It's very much the workers who would have cared for the homes in the Garden District and run businesses. There are interesting interjections in the book by T. Martin and others who remember Ella Brennan. The book traces Brennan's life growing up in the Irish Channel, her first job in the restaurant business, which was working in her older brother's bar keeping books, when he decided that the family needed to go into the food business. And so he bought the old Absinthe House in the French Quarter. Her mother was horrified. She didn't want her daughter going to the French Quarter daytime or nighttime, but she did. She kept the books. And that was how she learned for the first time how restaurant business in a bar works. And the book then follows her decades of on-the-job training when she learned how to run a restaurant, how to run a food restaurant, not just a bar restaurant. How she became a world-famous restaurateur who put New Orleans Creole cooking and hospitality on the map. The other book I'd like for you to read It's called A Long Way from the Strawberry Patch, and it's the life of Leah Chase. And it's written by Carol Allen with Leah Chase. It's a charming, charming book. It was published in August of 2020. It's considered a biography memoir, not an autobiography memoir like Miss Ella's book. And the reason is this one is really told more through Carol Allen's writings, although it's Leah's words. And it's told in the epistolary style. That's a style of a series of letters. And this book is a series of absolutely charming letters written from early childhood through senior citizen status by Leah Chase, and she's writing them to God. You must read it. She was born in Madisonville. It's on the North Shore across Lake Pontchartrain from New Orleans. Only 38 miles, as the crow flies, to New Orleans, but light years away. She was a very religious young woman and older woman, child. Her family was a rural family. They were not wealthy, but they did have means. She was surrounded by superb cooks. She learned to cook at home, and that would serve her well in the future. The letters in the childhood begin in August of 1935, when Leah is facing a major life change. She's going to move from Madisonville, comfort, home, family, to New Orleans to go to a convent school. The final letter is dated September of 2018, so it really does bridge her whole life. It traces the life from the very humble beginnings, learning to cook, learning a little bit then when she gets to New Orleans and graduates from the convent school, graduates high school, learns a little bit about the restaurant business. She becomes a waitress in a kind of an upscale restaurant and sees how that works. She's never been in one before. And she moves through that and finally becomes a legend in the United States and abroad for bringing a fusion of Creole and Cajun country cuisines to the world. This is a picture of Miss Ella. She was not lucky in love. She married once and she did have children, and then she divorced. Miss Leah was lucky in love. She married once and had a beautiful marriage for a long time. Ella was born in 1925. She died in 2018. She grew up in New Orleans and she lived there all her life. She survived the Great Depression. She had no formal education beyond high school, except for a few months when she went to secretarial school and was bored out of her skull. She taught herself through reading, asking, questioning, observing. The funniest thing about Ella Brennan to me is that she did not know how to cook and she refused to learn. That was not what she was interested in the slightest. Instead, she was fascinated by the business side of the restaurant, and she literally learned it from the ground up. She put Creole haute cuisine on the map, the high Creole, the most sophisticated. She lifted service and hospitality to new heights. She established what she called the gang service, which was where everyone at a table gets served at exactly the same time as everyone else at that table. She thought that good food, good service, and top-shelf hospitality were the keys to success. Leah had a different life path. Here's a picture of her, and this is the way she's just about always pictured when people are photographing her. A happy smile. She looks like not a care in the world. She looks like somebody you want to just go play with. She's just cute as she could be. She was born in 23. She grew up in Madisonville. She moved to New Orleans, never left it. She, like Ella, survived the experience of the Great Depression. And for both women, that impacted the way they looked at food and food service. She, like Ella, had no formal education beyond high school. And she learned from experience and from experimentation. She did cook. She loved to cook. And she loved to tweak her dishes in special ways. That's how she came up with the fusion of the Cajun and the Creole. Phenomenal chef. She improved on both the classic Creole dishes and the Cajun country foods by giving them her own Leah twist. She also put her adopted home neighborhood, Madisonville, now Treme. She put that neighborhood on the map in New Orleans first, because people who didn't live there never went to Treme, and later to all of America. She created a fine dining experience for people of color. She transformed a po' boy and lottery ticket shop into a full-service restaurant. She felt, and where have you heard this before, she felt that good food, good service, and top-shelf hospitality were the keys to the restaurant business success. The women came up through two different life experiences. This is a picture of Brennan's on Royal Street, which for a long time was the signature restaurant of the Brennan family. So Ella was working with classic French cuisine in a very elegant surrounding, white linen tablecloths, smartly dressed, beautifully trained waiters. Brennan's on Royal Street in the Quarter was where Ella spread her wings to learn more about hospitality and service. While Ella was working in a very upscale environment, Leah's environment and training ground was completely different. This is a picture, an early picture of the Dooky Chase restaurant. At the time, it was just Dooky Chase. And this is where her mother-in-law and father sold po' boy sandwiches and lottery tickets. Leah worked with the foods that she knew well, country cooking, but with Spanish, French, and African influences put in them. And she was working as she evolved the restaurant and transformed it. She was working with customers who did not have a clue what fine dining meant or what a fine dining experience would be. Ella's customers came in. They knew what they needed, what they expected, and it better be right. Leah's customers in the beginning just wanted a sandwich, and they didn't care about anything else because they had never had the experience of anything else. She decided that she was going to change this, and this was really Leah Chase's calling. One of the most interesting things that happened while Leah was trying to transform this space into a real restaurant and was trying to educate her people about what fine dining was that she would introduce slowly new dishes for them. And many times they wouldn't recognize what they were. This is a picture of the very common to us shrimp cocktail. And when she served it for the first time, her customers thought it was a drink. Slowly and with lots of love and lots of delicious food, she educated Treme to the world that lay just beyond. When talking about those early days when she was trying to create a restaurant like the ones in the French Quarter, she often talked with love about her customers and at their amazement at eating in a real restaurant. In that world that Leah described as being just beyond, Ella Brennan was introducing a new level of service to her customers. I mentioned earlier the gang service. Here's a picture of it actually being implemented. Ella loved it. If everyone's dish was put before him, at exactly the same time around the table. So nobody was served first, and nobody was served last. She also said this: "We started a gang service. A runner brings the food into the dining room. Then the waiters stand behind each seat with the correct dish. On signal, they serve each guest at the same time. Eliminates that awkward, 'Okay, who had the salmon?' moment." Remember, Ella Brennan is more interested in how to make the restaurant efficient and a wonderful experience for the diner than she is about the food. The food she left to the chefs that she very carefully hired and made sure were doing things just right. She made the comment, "I don't want a restaurant where a jazz band can't come marching through." She wanted a kind of let the good times roll atmosphere to permeate her restaurants. Commander's Palace ultimately became her signature property among the Brennan properties. It's a wonderful old Victorian. It sits in the Garden District, and you can see the picture here. It's just a wonderful place to eat. The Brennan family, under her brother Owen's leadership, had decided to buy the place that they would make Brennan's on Royal Street. It was sort of the third step for the Brennan family. They had done the old Absinthe House, and they understood bar service, and then they did a little restaurant called the Vouqueray, and they learned food service there. Now they were ready to put them together because they had kind of learned their craft. But just months before Owen's restaurant, Brennan's, was to open, Owen died. And so all of a sudden, the family, read that Ella, had to get up and make Royal Street property run. One of Ella's major contributions at Brennan's was she elevated breakfast as a serious meal. And it was because a lot of her friends liked to go out drinking all night, and then they needed to have someplace nice to come have breakfast. And so breakfast at Brennan's was born. However, over the years, a rift developed within the family between Owen's widow and other members of the family. And so essentially, Owen's widow fired Ella, and the family had to split up the assets, which were, of course, the properties. Ella got Commander's Palace. The widow got Brennan's. And for the next 40 years, Ella refused to go to Brennan's. Instead, she made Commander's Palace the hallmark of all the Brennan properties. And the Commander's Jazz Brunch became a major attraction. Going back to Leah now, the Dookie Chase restaurant, she also is having to learn basically by the seat of her pants. All during Leah Chase's life presented her with different challenges, and she met every single one. When her father-in-law died, her husband, Dookie Chase, decided that he would take over the restaurant. He was an entertainer, a very popular entertainer in New Orleans. So Leah had to go to work in the family business. She faced a very serious challenge because her mother-in-law liked the wings just the way they had always been, and Leah had bigger ideas. This is a picture of Leah in the new and improved Dookie Chase's restaurant after she got the things in it that she wanted to get in again to make that fine dining experience. She said in A Long Way from the Strawberry Patch, Leah said, "I want us to get rid of just sandwiches, fried fish on bread and stuff like that. I want tables with tablecloth, nice china and tableware. I want the restaurant to be a pretty place where our customers will enjoy themselves." Both of these women were extraordinarily successful businesswomen, but they were also equally interested in their community and in their country. Both found causes that they used their influence to support and time, and both of the women had considerable influence. For Ella, It was a campaign to keep casino gambling from coming into the city. For Leah, it was the civil rights movement. Both of them loved people, all people, and did their best to make the lives of others better through their actions. Leah did it in her kitchen. She said, "Food builds big bridges. If you can eat with someone, you can learn from them. And when you learn from someone, you can make big changes. We changed the course of America in this restaurant over bowls of gumbo. We can talk to each other and relate to each other when we eat together." She fed many notables, including Quincy Jones, Jesse Jackson, Duke Ellington, Thurgood Marshall, James Baldwin, Ray Charles, Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama, and Ernest Gaines, and she fed them well. President George W. Bush came for breakfast, and her group was kind of concerned and wondering, "Miss Leah, what are you going to serve the President of the United States?" And she said, "It's breakfast. It's breakfast. We're going to give him grits and quail. That's a country breakfast." So that's what he had, and he absolutely loved it. When President Barack Obama came to eat at Miss Leah's, he ordered the gumbo. If you look carefully at this picture, you'll see that instead of the smiling face that Miss Leah usually has, she has a face of consternation. The problem was President Obama put hot sauce in her gumbo. She slapped his hand away and said, "My gumbo doesn't need anything else." Chase said, "Everyone can cook if you try, if you put a little love into it." And I think probably this picture shows just how much love she put into every dish that she made. She married Dookie Chase, this popular entertainer. She thought she was going to be the wife of this star, and instead she becomes a cook for 7 decades in a restaurant that she starts as a po' boy outlet and lottery ticket outlet and ends up as one of the fine dining restaurants that's sought out by people who come to New Orleans every day. She never tired of creating food that she loved for people that she loved, and she loved everybody. She allowed civil rights groups to meet at the restaurant, and she would give them a meal, and they would sit and talk. That's the reason she said, "We changed America over bowls of gumbo." These two chefs are probably the best known of all the chefs that Miss Ella launched at Commander's Palace, Paul Prudhomme and Emeril Lagasse. While Jim and I have never met Lagasse, we did have the pleasure of meeting and knowing Paul Prudhomme. Very, very nice man. Prudhomme comes from the Cajun country side of cooking. His most famous quotation was when he said, "You don't need a silver fork to eat good food." And he knew that. He was one of 13 children from Opelousas in South Louisiana, Cajun country. And he learned to cook in his mother's and his grandmother's kitchen. They taught him, and he loved it. In the late 1960s, he moved back to New Orleans. He'd been there for a little while, and then he had tried his luck in Colorado cooking for a number of years. And he even had a burger joint that he tried to run, and it failed badly. But anyway, he finally came back to New Orleans because he felt like if he had any hopes of any career in cooking, it would have to be in New Orleans. And he wanted to share his family's recipes, this Cajun country cooking, with the people there. Chef Paul Prudhomme was born in 1940 and he died in 2015. He was a very enthusiastic chef. His personality was probably his biggest asset after his ability to create wonderful foods and wonderful spice combinations. Miss Ella hired him as the first American chef to run the Commander's Palace kitchen. Always before, she'd had classically trained French chefs. So now you get a real American. And not only that, he's a rural American. Now he would go on after Commander's Palace to develop his own restaurant with his first wife, Kay Paul's Louisiana Kitchen on Chart in the Quarter, and it was very successful. And he is known because he, like Leah Chase was doing at Dookie Chase's restaurant, he was fusing Creole high cuisine with Cajun country cooking. This is a picture of his restaurant, Kay Paul's Louisiana Kitchen. Great, great place. Community dining, just long tables, and you just sat wherever there was an empty chair. It was wonderful. Ella's decision to hire Prudhomme was based on her sense that he had a level of creativity that maybe Commander's was missing. With the classic French cuisine, Creole cuisine, there was a sort of anticipated deliciousness, but there was also a sameness. She wanted that routine to be jostled a little bit. She wanted the menu to be changed. When he went in to interview with her, he laughed and reminded her that they had met previously. When he had come to New Orleans in the very beginning, he worked as a busboy at Brennan's before there was a Commander's, and he met her there. Ella didn't remember him, but she said later he had gained a couple of 100 pounds by the time I saw him, so I didn't recognize him. She spent a lot of time getting to know him through conversations. Remember, she can't cook, but she's got to make sure he can. She wrote in Miss Ella's of Commander's Palace, Paul and I started talking a lot. Through these conversations, it became clear that Paul was trying to make us into Cajuns while we were trying to make him into a Creole, and all of us loved every second of it. The end result was something that would shake up the city and ultimately America. Prudhomme, Leah Chase, they're doing the same thing. He brought many new dishes to Commander's Palace. Two of the most popular, first blackened redfish. It became so popular that redfish fishing time had to be severely limited because we were running out, the Gulf was running out of redfish. It's a fabulous, fabulous dish. Ella, because she didn't cook, she would gather the chef and other family members, her daughter T. Martin, some of them. They would sit around a table at Commander's and they would taste test every new dish that a chef brought in, like Prudhomme. So when he put the blackened fish on the table for them to taste, she had a fit. She said, "It's just burnt fish." And Prudhomme looked at her and he said, "But have you tasted it yet?" When she did, she put it on the menu immediately. However, she refused to call it blackened redfish. She called it charcoal grilled fresh fish because she thought the blackened sounded like it was too much like burnt, but it was delicious, and it became one of the most popular dishes at Commander's that he invented. The other one was the bread pudding souffle, which I have actually made. This is a wonderful dessert. It's a little showy. It takes a little time, but it's definitely worth all the effort. It came about because Miss Ella had invited the American Cuisine Symposium in 1983 to have a big dinner at Commander's Palace while they were holding their annual symposium in the city of New Orleans. She already had traditional bread pudding, who didn't, on the menu at Commander's. But she told Prudhomme, we've got to do something different. We have to do something unique, special, first time for this group of people. So I want bread pudding, but do something with it. So he turned the bread pudding into a souffle and then created a very special whiskey sauce to be poured into the top of the souffle through a toasted egg white cap. It is to die for. When Prudhomme passed away, he was given a traditional second line from the cathedral to his restaurant, where chefs escorted his casket in white chef's coats and hats. Prudhomme was incredibly important to Ella Brennan and Commanders, but after him was going to come an equally important chef, the youngest chef hire Ella Brennan ever made. His name was Emeril Lagasse. When he was asked what it was like to come to Louisiana, he said, "I guess I feel that I was following my instincts and at the same time being guided by the best. I became totally intrigued with Louisiana, the people, the food. It is a part of my life. Everything that has happened for me since moving here has just been icing on the cake." Emeril was a musician. He played, as a teenager, he had a band. He played the percussion instruments, the drums, the cymbals. He was quite happy with that. He also was a very dedicated musician in his teen years. He could play a variety of instruments. He grew up in Fall River, Massachusetts, and he learned to cook from his mother, who was Portuguese. His dad was French Canadian. He worked in a Portuguese bakery during his teen years, and there he learned bakery and pastry making, bread and pastry making. And after high school, he turned down a full-ride music scholarship and entered Johnson & Wales University to earn a degree in foods. He wanted to become a chef. He worked in France for a little while at the end of his teens, early 20s. He wanted to master classic French cuisine. And then back in the US, he worked in New York, in Boston, and Philadelphia. Here's a picture of him shortly after he became the chef to follow Prudhomme at Commander's Palace. He's with Miss Ellen. And if you notice, he looks rather young. He was only 23 years old. This was the biggest shot in the dark Ella Prudhomme ever took in her hiring of chefs. He's not from here. He's from the North, the far North, and he's a child. He knew nothing about Creole foods. He knew nothing about New Orleans, but she gave him a chance because, like with Prudhomme, she saw in him a creativity which she thought would bump up yet again the Commander's Palace menu. He worked for her for 8 years, and he created many memorable dishes. He combined a lot of things. He was very creative. One of his best dishes was veal chapatulas, which is delicious, and rack of lamb with Creole mustard crust. And then this one that's pictured here, it's stuffed quail. It's quail stuffed with wild mushrooms. He eventually opened his own restaurant. When he told her he was going to do it, Miss Ella said, "I'll advise you, I'll help you all you need." He decided he wanted to open it in the warehouse district. It was just beginning to be transformed into condos and kind of hip places. Ella Brennan said he was crazy to open a restaurant there. He did anyway, and it turned out as a great success and became an anchor for the revitalization of that entire neighborhood. Here they are, Prudhomme and Lagasse, two who owed much of their success to Ella Brennan, and to whom Ella Brennan owed much of her success as a restaurateur. Both Prudhomme and Lagasse became icons of New Orleans cuisine. They were willing to experiment with foods that they loved, and the result was the modern American movement. It was emerging as they combined the best of the Cajun country with classic Creole, and in Lagasse's case, a smidgen or two of North. Same with Leah Chase. What surprised me the most as I was doing this research on these two women in New Orleans foods was just how much Leah Chase and Ella Brennan actually had in common. There's no question that New Orleans cuisine would not be as spectacular as it is if they had not influenced it. Both women lived at the same time and faced many of the same problems. Both had strong personalities that could be abrasive at times. Both were perfectionists, totally dedicated to their goals of providing the finest food and service to their communities. And because of their hard work and dedication, both received many awards during their careers, and both of them remained humble. In 1993, Ella Brennan accepted the James Beard Foundation's Outstanding Service Award. Years later, in 2009, she would be awarded the James Beard Foundation's Lifetime Achievement Award, which is the highest award that any chef or restaurateur can receive. She was not able to attend that ceremony because of health. But in 1993, when she accepted the Outstanding Service Award, which was really a tip of the hat to the innovative ways that she had created at her restaurant for people to be served by the waitstaff and so forth, she said, "I accept this award for every damn captain and waiter in the country." And that's why her people absolutely loved her, because she always gave the credit to the chefs, to the waitstaff, to the dishwashers, to everyone who was part of her Brennan family. Leah Chase in 2016 also was awarded the James Beard Foundation's Lifetime Achievement Award, the pinnacle. And on that occasion, she said, "Madisonville, just look at me now, a long ways from that strawberry patch." All those accolades that both women received, I think the praise that Miss Ella gave to Leah Chase may be the finest of all. Miss Ella wrote, "I would be remiss if I didn't mention my dear friend Leah Chase, the chef and proprietor of Dookie Chase's restaurant, who is a role model for me rather than a hands-on resource. Whether she is teaching the neighborhood children in Treme about respecting a business establishment that's trying to make a living and supporting lots of people, or feeding and advising the leaders of the civil rights movement, or organizing citizens to support the arts, this lady is a leader. She is the embodiment of walking the talk. She lives what she preaches, and she preaches about her belief in the common good. And that is something I wish people talked about more. This me take on life is the pits. Leah never bought into that. She gives and gives and gives, even when she is in the midst of tough times. I remember Leah showing up everywhere to support everyone after Katrina when she had lost everything. She just put her head down and started working on their comeback. She used to joke, "I can't die now, I owe everybody." She is the epitome of a class act. Leah helped, as much as anyone in this city, bring people together after that storm. Beautiful words. So, are you hungry? Somehow I think you might be. And we've talked about po' boys and black and red fish and bread pudding souffles and all kinds of wonderful things. But I think more important even than the cuisine were these two women and what they did, living roughly in the same time span, having many similar experiences and yet coming up through completely different paths. I think that's the most important thing about New Orleans cuisine. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you can now go have a nice snack. And I look forward to the next time that we're together. Thank you.